amidst all the concerns and the threats right now of the West expanding its war into Russia proper by allowing Ukraine to use American supplied or British supplied long range weapons into Russia, overnight there was a significant explosion in the Tver region, which is northwest of Moscow, where there was a massive explosion being reported by a Ukrainian drone, which found a very large ammunition depot somewhere in the northwest of Russia. And as you can see on your screen right there, is an absolute massive explosion. And there's no telling how much ammunition and other kinds of weapons were destroyed in this. So certainly from the Ukraine side, a big happy moment and a victory there. But how does this tie in with the larger war, and what kind of reaction might Russia do as a response? We have Doug Macgregor back today, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, decorated combat veteran, and just all around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Listen, I just kind of wonder what some of your thoughts are here when you're seeing this, because it's being reported that there was a drone, a Ukrainian drone. No question about so far where it originated, because you look on a map and there's some NATO countries that are pretty close to that, and it seems odd that a drone would be able to fly from Ukrainian territory all over the Russian heartland to land on that. But what are your thoughts on that? Is that possible?
I think the most important takeaway from this is that this validates President Putin's comments a few days ago, where he pointed out that Ukraine is incapable of doing very much of anything. It depends entirely on us. It depends on our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that's space-based. It depends on the transmission of that data to technicians, operatives on the ground in Ukraine and elsewhere in NATO that can then launch these weapons. Because the Ukrainians can't do it. The Ukrainians are now up to, we estimate, 600,000 dead in terms of soldiers killed in action. I mean, that's an astronomical number. That's a World War I level of casualties and losses over 2-3 years. The British lost, I think, almost 800,000 men killed during World War I. The Ukrainians have already lost 600,000 killed, and this is not even close to World War I. So I don't think the Ukrainians can do much of any of it, and I think that President Putin is right. So the question is, what do the Russians do in response? Well, they know that we are capable of detecting what's on the ground in Russia as well as in Ukraine. They can also detect what's on the ground in Germany and Poland as well as in Ukraine and the Baltic states. I think we'll see the launch of substantial numbers of hypersonic missiles that will have a devastating impact inside Ukraine. Now, whether or not they will move beyond that and now attack installations in Poland or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, I don't know. Putin has been the adult in the room to this point, Dan. He's the one who has contained the conflict. He's the one who's exercised restraint. We haven't. We keep pushing and pushing and pushing the envelope. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that very recently on Friday, there was no announcement about the United States' support for the use of long-range strike weapons against Russia. In fact, the opposite seems to be the case. We seem to have put the brakes on. And then on top of that, we have this attack in Russia. So it's unclear to me, what's really going on. It's also hard for me to believe that a UAV or an unmanned aerial vehicle, which is what we call drones these days, could have done this kind of damage. It looked to me like this was a missile strike. But I just don't know. I don't have the hard data. I don't have the facts. I don't know what was launched.
Yeah, but that whether it was a drone or whether it was a missile really has a lot of implications, because Putin pretty much put himself out on the line last Friday, as you mentioned, where he said that we would regard a strike again with a missile on Russian territory deep in our country as a direct intervention of the NATO, and that would mean they were in a direct state of war with us. Now, whether they conclude that's what happened or not is unclear, and what he would do immediately is also unclear. But the fact that we're toying with this really is evidence that, as you just said, we seem to not believe that Putin would ever do anything like that, that it's all bluster and he'll only bluff and he'll never do anything in regard. And I think that's more of a gamble even than a risk. And that just is in light of what's about to happen. So Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, is apparently days away from coming to the United States, where he's going to eventually give a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. But he's before that going to meet with President Biden to give him his victory plan. Watch this.
Meetings were held in various formats to prepare our Ukrainian victory plan. The real substance of all the points: military, political, diplomatic, and economic. Key people from each sector are involved. The necessary steps for Ukraine have already been clearly defined. The steps designed to give us the strongest possible position to bring about peace, a real, just peace. For each step, there is a clear list of what is needed and what will strengthen us. There is nothing impossible in this plan. Over 90% has already been written out. Together, this package can ensure the right development of the situation, not only for Ukraine, but for everyone in the world who values international law.
Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff there to unpack, but one of the ones that jumps right out at me, first of all, is that he said there's nothing unbelievable or impossible in this plan. Everything can be accomplished to victory. And of course, you have to go back to, you don't have to go very far back to the 2023 when they had this big offensive that was going to go to the Azov coast and take Crimea back and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Didn't quite work out that way. So what, Colonel, is different this time that Zelensky thinks that now, if he just gets whatever's on this list from Biden, that he can succeed?
I think this is for Zelensky, March, April 1865. I mean, the lines in Petersburg are about to collapse. He's been told he has no defense left. The only thing he can do is beg for weapons that allow him to make strikes against the Russians in depth. It's not going to win the war, but it creates the illusion that there's still life left in his regime. And I think that's what this is all about. Coming back and asking for more in this proximity to the election is probably his last gasp, if you will, because I think he knows that when the election is over, not much more is forthcoming. We just don't have the resources to send. I mean, the Pentagon apparently was informed, the Department of Defense, that the Ukrainians want 200 more Bradleys. Stop and think about that. 200 more Bradleys. Are they going to come out of the active army, or are these going to be new platforms by BAE Systems? I don't know. Again, I think it's over for all intents and purposes. And I think that Putin has got to weigh carefully what he wants to do, because, again, he has no interest in widening the war. We're the ones that seem to want to widen the war wherever we go, whether it's Europe or the Middle East. He doesn't want to do that. So at this point, we'll see what Putin does, but I think we should expect a hail of hypersonic missiles, directed at very critical targets inside Ukraine. And we'll see whether or not he chooses to attack something in Poland or Lithuania. Probably not in Romania, but I guess it's possible. I don't think the man wants to widen the war. So he will strike back. There's no question about it, and do enormous damage to what's left of the Ukrainian war effort. But he doesn't want to widen the war. I don't know why we would want to do such a thing. Ukraine is almost dead as a country. And then if you look at the Kursk operation, that has been a catastrophic failure. Over 200 tanks. I was looking at a list of damage that's been inflicted. Over 21 multiple rocket launchers, either HIMARS or MLRS, have been destroyed. I mean, the Russians are literally going out there and sort of tallying up. This is we're finding here that's being destroyed and annihilated. I don't know what kinds of prisoners they've captured, but there are a lot of dead on the ground. So it's, this is a strange Twilight Zone moment. I think it's all political theater. It's not real.
Yeah, and it's interesting because by many calculations, interestingly, earlier in the process of the Kursk advantage, Zelensky himself came on, and Sersky also echoed this, that they're not going to hold this territory forever. They just want to get some temporary negotiating leverage. They just want certain specific outcomes, and they would come back. And then later they changed it to, well, we're going to hang on to it for now. And I think that based on the fact that Zelensky is now days away from a meeting with Biden because of the political things. He can't withdraw now, but it's suicide to keep these guys out there. And by the way, I got an email from somebody who has access to a foreigner actually fighting in this zone, and they say that the Ukraine side is just getting slaughtered. Apparently, these numbers are true about all the casualties, and Ukraine has to keep flooding more and more troops in there to keep it from collapsing before his UN General Assembly briefing, or it's going to undercut what his message he's trying to sit. Now, in the possible, keep your fingers crossed hope, the U.S. administration's comments so far about this peace plan are not exactly warm and fuzzy. Watch this from our U.S. ambassador.
We have seen President Zelensky's peace plan. We think it lays out a strategy and a plan that can work. And we need to see how we can promote that as we engage with all of the countries, the heads of state who will be here in New York.
So you see, she's choosing her words there carefully. Well, that's our strategy. But you see, they didn't say, yes, we're definitely going to do this or we're going to go. So hopefully they're recognizing that a combination of what you see on the ground there about how, and of course, that's the Kursk. We could even talk about the Eastern Front, which is seen even more collapsing, and what's coming out of Russia to say, hey, this is not in our interest to do. But I'm not sure where they go from here, where the administration goes, how they navigate this unwinnable situation.
I think Ukraine is a body on the table that is on life support. And what they're arguing is that we should provide more adrenaline and put it straight into the heart yet again in the hopes that somehow or another this comatose patient will awaken, stand up, and fight to victory. It's not going to happen. It's over. So, yes, will we provide more adrenaline? Well, they haven't hesitated in the past, Dan. So I suspect that that's what we'll see again. But it's not going to change the outcome.
Now, let me ask you on a military perspective, because one of the primary components, which Zelensky has already previewed on his plan, is to have all the constraints on the long-range missiles removed so that he can strike deep into Russia. From a military perspective, for the moment, let's take off the table any consideration of what Russia may do as a response and just look at if Russia did nothing. Let's say, for example, that Putin was actually bluffing. He really was, and he's not going to do anything to NATO. Would these missiles change the dynamic of the war?
No, of course not. That's the whole point. Could we find other storage points similar to the one that was destroyed in Tver? I suppose so. But that's not going to fundamentally reverse the situation. It's not going to change a damn thing. In fact, if anything, it's going to provoke not only the response I talked about earlier with hypersonic missiles, but I think the Russians will realize that there's no end in sight unless they march all the way to the Polish border. And there are open discussions about doing that. They have the plans for it, and they do have the military personnel necessary to accomplish that. If that's what we want, if we want to see Russian armies back on Poland's borders, then by all means continue down this road, because that's where we're headed.
But now here's the interesting thing to me as to why we're even contemplating this. What you just said, there should be self-evident to anyone with an honest evaluation of the factors involved. But you had Secretary of Defense Austin actually come out and was asked about these given these long-range weapons. And he said, well, actually, you know what? There really aren't enough of them, even for the British and the French missiles, to sustain a campaign, which would be necessary to have any kind of operational impact at the front lines. You would have to have a campaign that would be sustained. But he said that we could not supply enough of these munitions to seriously damage a wide range of targets. Then added on top of that, Sullivan the other day talked about, he was asked at a conference in Kiev just a few days ago. He was asked about this whole issue about providing long-range weapons. And he said, first of all, he said, a lot of the problem is not that we're withholding them, is that our capacity is low. Then he said this, which was very, very illuminating about interceptor missiles.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
Doug, we don't have enough ATACMS missiles. We don't have enough. We don't have enough of the interceptors. We can't build them fast enough. I mean, and you don't even get started on 155 millimeter rounds and probably in other categories of things. But the stuff that you really need to sustain a war, we don't even have it anymore. So why then would anyone even want to contemplate continuing a war which we can't even support?
One of Israel's greatest military commanders, a man named Doron Almog, has said repeatedly, you can do whatever you want with long-range strike weapons, but if you lose the close fight, you're finished. So the close fight is lost, and there's no way to win the close fight. So shooting missiles over the heads of collapsing fronts, retreating forces is going to change a thing. It's almost similar to the V2 rocket campaign at the end of the Second World War. They weren't very accurate, and they were launching them at cities, and of course Hitler was told, no, launch them at ports, at harbors, launch them at aerodromes and so forth. But it wasn't there. They didn't have that capability. So this is foolish nonsense. The second point is, I think this is very important because we've touched on this in the past. We have no surge capability in the United States in terms of our scientific industrial base that supports the armed forces. Every time the Patriot engages, it fires 3 missiles at every incoming target. Well, at that rate, you're going to exhaust the missiles that you have in your magazine very, very quickly. And that's what's happened. We can't build them quick enough in order to make a difference. So we don't have the munitions. The same thing is true for AMRAAMs. Those are critical to supply NASAMs, which are really designed to shoot down low-flying cruise missiles, helicopters, and so forth. So the combination is hopeless. And I think Lloyd Austin was, thankfully, being honest. We can't supply them in great enough numbers quickly enough to make a difference. And we should be concerned at this stage about the fragility of our own capabilities, Dan. What if we suddenly had to fight a real enemy, like a real capable opponent like the Russians or the Iranians or the Chinese? And there are others out there. I mean, I've really grown tired and fatigued by this attitude in Washington that everyone outside of North America and Europe is somehow or another backward and incapable. This is not true. Capabilities that we monopolized 30, 40 years ago are now proliferating widely. So we need to get out of this mindset, but we don't seem to want to. And I think whoever ends up becoming the next president, whoever takes over, is going to find that not only have we spent ourselves into bankruptcy, but we've also exhausted our military capabilities to a very dangerously low level.
Yeah, and I want to go down that path here because there's some, I think, some connecting of the dots that needs to be done here for a lot of the American audience, and really for the Washington audience, quite frankly, in that there is this belief that what Putin said last Friday about how he would consider the use of long-range weapons manned and operated by the West would be a direct intervention and would be a state of war, basically. And then he would take appropriate countermeasures, which many of his officials were echoed after that. And there's many in the West who said he'll never do it. There's no way. It's just a bunch of bluff. He's trying to prevent us from just doing what we're going to do, but he won't. But now I'm going to ask you, put yourself in the Russian position for a minute. And you just saw the National Security Advisor for the United States admit that there is critical low stockpiles worldwide for our interceptor missiles. You saw the Secretary of Defense say that we don't even have enough of the long-range missiles to give to Ukraine, much less to use on our own. And then you also have this a lot of people have forgotten about this, but Gary, if you can throw up that 5% figure, one of the senior NATO officials, I believe it was a few months back, said we only have 5% of the air defenses needed to protect our flank. So if you're the Russians, are you really going to bluff if you see that the capacity to wage war on the NATO side is this low?
I think we have to go back and look carefully at the calculus that I think President Putin considers carefully every day. First of all, neither he nor the Chinese nor the Iranians nor anybody else I can find in the Middle East is interested in a war. We're the ones that have resorted to the use of military power to bully our opponents into submission. We are doing it through our proxies, the proxy in Ukraine and the proxy in Israel. I think we've exhausted this capability, but we're continuing to push it on the assumption that we will not be challenged. And as you point out, I think that's a very dangerous approach, because the Russian patience, and I think the patience everywhere across Eurasia with our behavior and our policies, is at an end. So I think it's very possible that we could shower NATO with hypersonic missiles that we know we can't shoot down. I don't care how many Patriots they ship over there, they're not going to shoot them down. And as a result, we could see tremendous losses. Now, what do we do at that point? Do we react and say, well, we're going to use nuclear weapons? Well, if you do, that's Armageddon. No one will survive. You can't fight and win a nuclear war. That's nonsense. The Russians understand it. The Chinese understand it. I think there are people in Washington who do understand it, but you have a problem. You have people with no personal experience of war who think it is possible. They need to be removed from office as quickly as possible. I think we know some of them sit in the Senate, and undoubtedly there are some in the Department of Defense. We've got to rein this thing in. No one seems to be willing to do it. No one seems to be in charge. You cannot convince me that President Biden is really cognizant of any of this. I don't think he's in charge. The question is, who is in charge? There is no strategy. There has never been a strategy. Harming Russia is not a strategy. That's a wish. It has no strategic foundation. You're dealing with people on the other side who are strategic thinkers, and they are asking themselves, what do we want this world to look like when this war ends? President Putin and Xi want to do business with the West. They don't want perpetual war and conflict. They want to compete with us. BRICS is all about competition with us. And people have walked away from us because we're destructive, because we've opted for military power again and again instead of negotiations, diplomacy, and economic development. Now, that's where we are. The question is, how far are we going to be pushed before it becomes patently obvious that we're finished and we can't go any further?
Well, and
no one in Washington wants to admit anything.
No, they don't. There are no limits. Yeah, I mean, we've shown a number of times how you had Biden say, we're the most powerful nation on the history of the world. That's one, but there's a bunch of them, and it's just kind of a common theme. We're their indispensable nation. We govern the world, and the world needs us. I mean, they believe some of this stuff, but the rest of the world doesn't. So here's the problem. Anytime you're talking about this issue here, especially with the potential between NATO and Russia, nothing exists in a vacuum. It's all connected to other things, and that's already happening. Here just a couple of days ago, Russia and China had the largest naval drills since the Soviet Union times, when they had over 400 ships of various types that were involved with this, and 90,000 personnel in the Sea of Japan. I think that's actually still going on as we speak here. And then also there's been an increase in air closing to U.S. Territory near the Aleutian Islands. And General Ryder was asked recently about that. Watch his answer.
There's been, I think, up to 28 different incursions by Russian and Chinese aircraft around Alaska in the last several weeks. What is going on from your point of view?
Well, as I think you heard my colleague Sabrina mention yesterday, I mean, we're certainly aware of that. To my knowledge, those aircraft did not enter into U.S. airspace. And it's not the first time that we've seen the Russians and the Chinese flying, in the vicinity. And, that's something that we obviously closely monitor. And it's also something that we're prepared to respond to. But in this particular case, it did not pose a threat to U.S. national security. And I'd refer you to the Russians in terms of why they feel compelled to want to look at the United States a little bit closer.
But the numbers are certainly on the rise. There's been many more incursions than over past years.
In terms of why those numbers are what they are, again, I'd refer you to them.
I'd refer you to them. What is your assessment of why Russia and China would be choosing this time to increase their patrols? I know a lot of this happened in the Cold War, but it hasn't since. Why now?
Well, remember, we've talked about this before, about the capacity of the Russians to horizontally escalate. In other words, you do something to us in northern Russia or southern Russia, whether it's Ukraine, White Russia, or somewhere else, we can act in the Pacific. In other words, we have the capacity to make life miserable for you. We can cause you to stretch your resources to the breaking point. I think that's really what this is all about, because again, they're not interested in a war with us. That's the last thing in the world that they want. And we know that. We know that because we have intercepts that tell us that. Are there hotheads on the other side? Of course, you have hotheads in Moscow. You've got some hotheads in Beijing. But the people who govern, the people that control the power in those states are completely disinterested in a war with the United States and NATO. So this is another exercise in trying to signal us in a rather straightforward manner that if you really want this, you're going to end up in a global conflict. And that, of course, has been the warning that people like Professor Mearsheimer and RFK Jr. and many others have sounded repeatedly, that what starts in one area can rapidly spread and engulf the whole world. We have no interest in this. The American people have no interest in this. This is a rogue element in Washington that is taking us down a road that we would never support. But when is the last time that anybody debated these things in the Senate or the House? When's the last time that anybody asked for a declaration of war? Instead, we get these authorizations for the use of force, which are open-ended and drag on in perpetuity. The American people haven't paid attention. They're comfortable. Well, they're about to become very uncomfortable if we proceed down this road any further.
Yeah, and I want to highlight there, all those authorizations for the use of military force, those have been against, as you have said many times throughout the last couple of decades, against places that have no air force, no navy, no logistics, no armored forces, etc. It's just a bunch of weak things. So you can do whatever you want, and it literally can drag on forever because none of them can do anything against us. That's not the case if we start talking about state-on-state conflict, and that was really highlighted recently and apparently forgotten by many in Washington. There was actually a number of recent examinations of what would happen in a simulated war if the United States, for whatever reason, got into a fight with China. And the Center for the Strategic and International Studies a year or two ago came out and said, the U.S. could lose up to 4 aircraft carriers defending Taiwan, and somewhere between 200 and 700, depending on the circumstances, aircraft that we could lose on that. And it's ironic because they only looked at the first 30 days of the conflict, and they claimed that China failed because they didn't win in 30 days. But of course, China doesn't think in those terms, and we would be out of resources. And that was one of the big takeaways, is that we would run out of critical missiles, especially for ship defenses, within weeks, and we wouldn't be able to restock them. Ergo, the ships are going to the bottom of the South China Sea, etc. And now then you take away our ships there. And again, this is all connected. So now what do you think Russia's going to do? What would China do if they get into a fight? I think that they see that our capacity to defend is quite limited.
We are still organized to refight some version of World War II. We are reliant on the instrumentalities with which we fought the Second World War. We are living with a National Security Act that was passed in 1947 that effectively codified the way we fought the war. Now, here we sit. It's 2024. We're in the 21st century, but our thinking is stuck in the middle of the 20th century. And we are victims of this disease called gunboat diplomacy, that we can somehow or another bully everybody and they'll submit. They'll go along with what it is that we want. Those days are over. And if we push this much further, we're going to get a taste of our own medicine. But it's not going to be in the form of World War II instrumentalities. It's going to come in the form of hypersonic missiles that are satellite guided and based, and we're going to lose our satellites. We're going to see satellite arrays disrupted and destroyed. And once that happens, we are in a great deal of trouble because we are much more reliant on that than anybody else. And the Russians and the Chinese and others are prepared to send up satellites very quickly. No one has paid attention, but very recently, Iran launched a satellite. And they have the capacity to launch satellite surrogates. These are aerostats and unmanned systems. We aren't prepared for the long haul. If anything, we are a short-fused fight. That's our orientation. We go in, we bomb people into submission, and then we land, declare victory, and dictate policy. We're not ready for the kind of fight that would ensue if we were up against the continental powers of Eurasia. We do not have tens of thousands of aircraft. We don't have tens of thousands of missiles that we need. The whole thing is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Instead of pushing this envelope, we should seek an alternative solution and get out of the mess that we're in. Anybody looking at our position today rationally would say it's time to disengage from these conflicts, retrench. We've got to throw away this old force structure and build a new one, something that fits the needs of the 21st century. No one wants to go there. We make money from these old platforms, this old way of doing business, this old structure that has 44 4-stars in it. It's absurd.
I wonder, Doug, if you can kind of talk about in that in a little bit different context. We have an army that I think the last number I saw of active duty is somewhere around 450,000, 460,000 troops. The vast majority of which are support and logistics and other kinds of things, maybe 80, 100,000 fighters total in our active force right now. We just saw that Russia has expanded, has given a decree to expand another almost 200,000 to now 1.5 million active forces in their army. Now, they have been dramatically reshaped and reorganized since 2022. So what is the net of where our army is right now and where the Russian army is going to be, say, by the end of this year?
Well, you're also dealing with two very different forces. The ground force in Russia, along with its rocket forces and missile forces, is organized for a different kind of warfare that we've discussed before. This is the ISR strike sustainment maneuver structure. It's what I wrote about in 2003 in Transformation Under Fire. This is where the Russians are, and they're prepared to fight that way and fight very effectively, and they have great depth in their force. As you point out, we have no depth in our force. And if you think you're going to mobilize the National Guard and throw them into the active force and keep them there for years, you've got another thing coming. We're not prepared for it, and the American people won't support it. We're shadow boxing. We're simply playing for time. Get to the election. When the election is over, well, then we can all cut our losses and move in new directions. But right now, we're playing for time. It's a serious, serious strategic mistake because we risk being more than simply embarrassed. We risk serious losses, a defeat, a strategic defeat that cannot be concealed from the American people. Look how upset people were with our departure from Afghanistan.
Right.
Well, imagine that on steroids happening in Europe and Asia because we're not ready to fight. We're not ready to fight a new kind of warfare. We need to get out of these places and we need to retrench and we need to reorient our entire thinking about the world. We've got to stop pretending that everybody outside of North America and Europe is backward, incapable, and easily buffaloed. They're not. The world is a different place today from what it was 100 years ago. In fact, if you look at the world today and you look at the way these places like China, Iran, look at the Turks, look at the Arabs, look at the people in Russia, you're looking at the resurgence of civilizational states and cultures that have been in hibernation, I would argue, for at least the last 200 or 300 years, because we walked in with technology that outstripped them. Well, today that technology is no longer our monopoly, and we're going to have a hard time keeping up with where they're headed. The good news for us, and this is what nobody wants to talk about, is that they're not interested in war. Oh, they'll compete with us, but they'll compete with us on the economic level. And that's where we should be, because that's where we are at our best. What made us a great power was not endless wars and conquest of territory. What made us a great power was the growth and development of our economic prosperity. This enormous economic engine that we came out of the 19th century with and continued to develop through the middle of the 20th. It's been stagnating. It's sitting there. It needs to be reinvigorated. We've got to get us back on track as an economic power. We've got to restore the losses that we've taken in the economy, in the manufacturing base. We have to manufacture new things. We have to reinvigorate the agricultural sector. We have to reinvigorate our energy sector and high-end manufacturing, instead of waging these pointless and wasteful conflicts in areas that, frankly, are of marginal strategic interest to the American people.
And if I could just perfectly tail into that, if we were only talking about the issues in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, it would be a really alarming situation. Stuff, and we have to do every word that you just said there. But we're not done there yet, because you talked about it's a global issue, and we are, I think, maybe on the cusp of getting sucked into another war in the Middle East. You've got, Gary, if you can pull up that one piece that I put up there, that one headline about the Middle East. I mean, look, we can't even stop the Houthis in there. We think we're going to stop the Russians with a few long-range missiles. And of course, you just had this issue with all these pagers exploding. And it looks by all accounts that Netanyahu's trying to do everything he can to launch into a new war in Hezbollah in the southern Lebanon, which he's said is a new war aim. He continues to do things to try and spawn attacks by by Israel, Iran against Israel. Because we have said many times that if Iran does anything to Israel, we'll immediately come to their aid militarily. So it is in Netanyahu's interest to try to spawn a war, and we don't seem to be able to stop him. We kind of are on a path that if anything happens further in there, that we are going to get sucked into the war. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think your description is accurate. Both parties right now are merging into the uniparty.
Just watching the footage of those illegal.
This resolution. And so.
Sorry about that. It's all right. They're merging into the uniparty that we're familiar with. And the uniparty is hostage to money. And the money comes from the Israel lobby and the people that in the United States who are enormously wealthy, who are determined to shape policy. So that's a foregone conclusion. You're asking people who are in terms that most Americans would understand, on the take, to back up, refuse the money and say, no, we're not going to support that. I don't see that happening. In fact, I see the opposite happening. I think we are going to unconditionally underwrite whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. However, there is a caveat. The caveat is as follows. We're telling him privately, if you're going to do this, you better do it quickly, because we cannot afford to maintain all these carrier battle groups and supporting forces and air forces all over the Middle East and Europe waiting for your war to begin. In other words, either act or we're leaving, because we can't afford to stay. I think that's where we are at this point, and I think that's the message that's being delivered to Mr. Netanyahu. I'm sorry that that's the message, because I think we should say the opposite. I think we should say we did not sign on for a regional war with Islam, because that's what this has become. All you have to do is look at the situation in Egypt and Jordan. Those two governments are on life support right now. King Abdullah just watched his entire government walk away from him, resign. Sisi is in fear of his life. So is Abdullah, because the millions of Arabs who live in those countries are furious. They're furious because these two Arab governments have abandoned millions of Palestinian Arabs to their Israeli executioners. That's the view on the ground in the Middle East. You have a similar situation in Turkey, at least insofar as Erdogan is concerned. He's talked a great game, but he hasn't done anything. And the population wants action. He's afraid of action because it has economic consequences. The population thinks that they should act anyway. You have a similar phenomenon, not quite as strident in Iran. The Iranian people are not walking away from the government. Anybody who thinks that going to war with Iran will somehow or another result in the fall of the government and the abandonment of that government by the population is wrong. It's forcing cohesion on Iranian society, because while they may not like the mullahs in Tehran who continue to oppress them with these religious restrictions, they do not want to surrender to American and Israeli pressure. So the whole region, and we can go beyond that across North Africa, down into Indonesia and Malaysia, everyone, the entire Islamic world is up in arms and is opposed to this. Why would we want to go to war with Islam? It's one thing to say we don't want Sharia law in the United States, and that's absolutely correct. And we should under no circumstances tolerate that here on American soil. But that doesn't mean that we want to go to war with Islam.
Right.
You know, this is ridiculous. And all of these things have consequences. And the Russians and the Chinese are on the periphery, and they're not going to sit it out, because the Chinese in particular, along with Japan and Korea and other people in Northeast Asia, are extremely dependent upon the oil and natural gas that comes out of the Middle East. That's why the Chinese have sent additional naval forces. Now, these are no match for us. If we want to sink them, we can do that. But then that puts us at war with China.
Right.
Why would we want to do that? That makes no sense. Everything in Washington is built on this fiction that the world hates us. Well, a lot of people in the world are fed up with this. There's no question about it. We've cultivated a lot of hostility against us. But going to war with us is not something that anybody really wants to do. But if we continue to push, we'll get what we want.
So
and
let me
right
ask
now,
you this.
Washington wants war.
So you just laid out an incredibly articulate vision for what we should do, which is focus on economic competition, not military conquest. A lot of really good fundamental reasons to why that's the right course of action. But then what do you say to those people like the Jack Keens, like the Lindsey Grahams, and any number of other people who say, man, you can't do that. You will surrender to them. They'll see that we're weak, and then they'll really come after us and put us on. What do you say to those arguments?
Well, first of all, if we are dragged into a major war that we're not prepared for, we will certainly take serious losses. And if you're worried about looking weak and incapable, that's the worst possible outcome. Right now, the American brand militarily is still widely regarded as a very potent and capable force. The last thing we want to do is to demonstrate that that may not be the case, Dan. And we know that our armed forces are by no means in good shape. We can't even get American men to join it. You know, that's our biggest problem. Nobody wants to be in it anymore. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is we're stuck with a lot of so-called legacy equipment and platforms and tactics and operational thinking that make no sense. We're still pursuing this global military hegemony when there's neither the need for it, nor is it something we should aspire to, because it's unattainable.
Yeah.
You know, this is the dream of universal empire and international governance. It's all nonsense. It won't work. We can't afford it. We don't want it. We don't need it. So the bottom line is, you know, Eisenhower used to say the American people want prosperity and security. And he said they deserve both. And he made it clear that in order for the American people to have both prosperity and security, that there had to be limitations on the amount of resources that were invested in defense, because he understood very well there's very little return on investment. I mean, you can only build so much equipment, and then suddenly you reach the tipping point where you go beyond that. There's no return on it, because in a certain number of years, it's no longer valuable. And there is no salvage value unless you can sell your secondhand equipment to nations around the world that want to buy it.
Yeah, pennies on the dollar. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole thing it makes no sense. So They are part of this warfare state that sees great profit in the war thus far. They haven't been on the receiving end of losses. This again, this is the difference between Eisenhower and many of the presidents that succeeded him. Eisenhower did not emerge from World War II convinced that we could conquer the world. On the contrary, he looked at what the Soviets went through and the Germans, and he said, we can never do that. That is not something the American Republic can sustain. And so he said, we can't go to war again and ever repeat this kind of performance. So he wanted to build alliances to try and deter, but he wanted to focus investment at home on the prosperity and the economic and scientific industrial power that we needed to develop. We are still living on the legacy of Eisenhower. That includes our nuclear deterrent. That includes the structure that we live in. Everything is a legacy of what Eisenhower did in the 1950s. Well, here we are in 2021. That legacy has gotten us a long way, but now it's putting us at great risk. We need a new structure, a new way forward, and we have to rebuild that prosperity.
Indeed, we do. And in the last bit of time we have here, I wonder if you can kind of war game something out for our audience. I know in conversations you and I have had over many years in the past, is that you've often looked at the British when they lost their empire. And I think that probably World War II, the victory was actually the death knell in some of that. What is the risk to America in the current age if we get broken militarily and we actually get the wars that we're threatening and it costs us everything? What is the impact on the other side of that to American prosperity?
Well, I think there's always a danger that we end up like Britain after World War II. Britain was interested in World War I in quote unquote expanding its empire. That's why the Versailles Treaty produced, places like Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and so forth and Syria. We carved up the Ottoman Empire. We shrank Germany. We were trying to position ourselves. I mean, the British were trying to position themselves to be a world power, only to discover it was an illusion. They ended up getting out of all of those places because it cost them more to be there than they could afford. And as World War II approached, they insisted that they were defending their empire, especially India, the Suez Canal, the route to India, which was the British cash cow. Well, that didn't work out, did it? They lost everything. We could lose everything. We could definitely become completely isolated, and we may not be able to recover as a great power. This, I think, is what Mearsheimer and others have talked about, and they're right. You put everything at risk over what you think at the time is important. It turns out it wasn't. When nobody ever bothers to point out, and this is just a sidebar, but when Hitler invaded Western Europe, this was not a war of conquest. He was simply interested in neutralizing Britain and France and the other countries so that he would have a free hand against the Soviets. What if the British had said, fine, we'll back off. You can have a free hand with the Soviets. We would have seen a different outcome. But the British were obsessed with destroying Germany. We seem to be obsessed with destroying Russia. And Russia hasn't invaded anybody and doesn't want to. The whole thing in Ukraine is because we goaded them into it. The Chinese, where are the massive Chinese armies ready to strike into Southeast Asia? They don't exist. And the Chinese Navy, at least a third or more of it, qualifies as a Coast Guard because that's their real objective, is to protect China's coast against who? Us.
Yeah.
Why are they worried about Taiwan? Because we might put missiles on it. We need to get out of these places and stop threatening everyone. We may discover that we actually have an opportunity to do business and develop ourselves economically. But no one's thinking about that. The British didn't think about it in the 30s. We're not thinking about it now. The outcome was Britain was destroyed. We inherited everything that the British had. They lost everything. There's no one to inherit us.
Yeah, except for probably China and Russia would certainly benefit if we felt about that, because I think they could afford the losses much better than we can, because I don't need to read.
Well, actually, if you sit down and you talk to them, they don't want to lose us as a trading partner. They don't want our commercial capability destroyed. They want to do business with us. That's what we don't seem to understand.
No, we don't at all. And we are definitely locked in this mentality at the so-called elite level that all we can see is the barrel of a gun. And if it doesn't have the barrel of a gun, then they don't even want to talk about it, because what you mentioned means that we have to compete, meaning sometimes we win, sometimes we lose economically, but the nation prospers and is secure as a result. And somehow that's the disconnect that they can't seem to get beyond.
That's right.
We have what it is. Well, listen, really appreciate you coming on today and giving us man, if there's ever been a clear vision of where we are, what we're risking by going down that militaristic path, and what we could stand to gain by going down this other rational path where we maintain both economic prosperity and security, is crystal clear. And really appreciate that, Doug.
Sure. Thanks, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Thanks so much for joining us today. And by the way, we have another episode coming up later today, a little different than ones we've had. I'm going to be interviewing General Ben Hodges. And if you've been watching our show for any amount of time, you know very often I take issue with some of the stuff he has. And we thought we'd invite him on the show today to give his side of things. You may be a little bit surprised by how that goes, and then you may not be as well, but you'll get to make your own decisions about how that, about what you think of that. But we're going to give him a chance to have his say. Watch this afternoon. It'll be on our channel, and we will see you. Sorry. Thanks for reminding me, Gary. We also are on everywhere where there's podcasts now. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict, everywhere where you get podcasts. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You got to type all that in, and you will be able to follow us on podcasts. Thanks very much, and we'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.